Well, we're 10 minutes late. We should. Ooh. Guess you can turn it on. Good afternoon. We should get started because we're starting a little late. Welcome everyone to the panel 3A, very auspicious. The potential and pitfalls of an algorithmic society. We've had some exchanges via email over the weekend, and I think you're in for an interesting session here. So the format we're going to follow is we'll give each panelist an opportunity to speak for 2 to 5 minutes. Then we'll have some inter-panel discussion, or within-panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to the floor for discussion. So let me introduce the panel members. I'm David Madigan. I'm a professor of statistics here at Columbia. I'm also the Dean of Arts and Sciences. To my right is Bernard Harcourt, who's a professor at Columbia Law School and also in political science. Frank Pasquale, beside him, is a law professor at the University of Maryland. To his right is Solon Boracas, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Information Technology at Princeton University. And to his right is Roxana Geambasu, who's an assistant professor of computer science here at Columbia. So before I hand it over, we're going to go in this order. Before I hand it over, I just want to say my particular interest in this topic concerns healthcare. And my own work is mostly in the context of large-scale data analysis in healthcare. Healthcare is an area, it seems to me, where we very much need to move towards more algorithmic approaches. So right now, the way we practice healthcare in this country, as much as it was in the Middle Ages, which is to say we rely on the subjective expertise of a clinician to reason with very large amounts of information, large amounts of historic data, evidence of all sorts. The basic process seems preposterous to me. So we've recently conducted a study looking at a group here based at Columbia called Odyssey, the Observational Healthcare Data Science and Informatics Collaboration. We looked at first line of pharmaceutical treatment for a number of chronic diseases like depression, diabetes, and hypertension in a collection of databases, the union of which contains about 250 million patients. So it's a non-trivial fraction of the world's population. And in the context of, say, hypertension, there are 5 drugs that are commonly used as the first line of treatment for hypertension, none of which are used in more than 20% of patients. So there are 5 of them between 10 and 20%. So in essence, there's a sort of a uniform distribution over the first line of treatment. This is crazy. So this needs to be algorithmically driven. The choice of drugs should be based on the patient's specific characteristics and the evidence we have in these large databases and randomized trials and so on for these drugs. So I'm a proponent of algorithmic approaches in the context of healthcare. We need to get subjective decision-making out of the picture in terms of much of health, not all, but much of healthcare delivery. So that's the particular perspective that I'm interested in hearing about, but we're going to talk much more generally about all kinds of things on this panel. But I just use my prerogative, seeing as I'm sitting here, to give you my opinion on one matter. So with that, I will turn it over to Bernard, who's going to lead us off.
Thank you, David. And so just to kind of continue that conversation, I suppose my immediate response to the suggestion is whether it's possible to imagine, is it possible to imagine a Hippocratic algorithmic oath? Okay? And so the question stems from my concern, really, that so much of what's driving algorithms today is a commercial motive modeled on the Amazon and the Google methods. So it makes it difficult to separate the purely Hippocratic algorithm from all of the other more dominant commercial for-profit ways that we're using algorithms today. And I think that it's a real challenge, particularly given our political economy of healthcare today. In other words, the way that the healthcare industry is working. And so the question I would ask, really, or the thing I would want to probe, is whether or not the algorithms are going to be determining what might be the correct first drug of choice for hypertension, or are they more likely to be, say, profiling to recommend unnecessary dietary supplements, or to allow particular tech-savvy pharmaceuticals to push their pet medications. And I think that's the tension. I think that's the tension today, and that's the tension that we see with the use of algorithms. In part because the way in which they are being used predominantly today is not so much, I think, to find accurate solutions as it is to recommend products and shape subjectivities, to shape people. And this goes back a little bit to this morning, the conversation with Ken Pruitt and the first panel, our keynote panel, which is, are there different epistemologies from the scientific, peer-reviewed epistemology, which would give us, hopefully, the right first drug of choice, versus what seems to be so dominant today, which is a different kind of approach to data analytics and algorithms. I think it's represented, for instance, in President Obama's recent Center for Global Engagement, which is out of the State Department. And what the Center for Global Engagement is doing is using all this big data to try to prevent radicalization of youths. But again, it's a question of using the data to shape people, just the way, and so it's drawing on the model of Amazon and Google to kind of deploy it in the political context. And the idea here is to identify vulnerable youths who might be radicalized, and then to feed them third-party content, enhanced third-party content, without, of course, indicating that it's coming from the US, in order to shape them. And I think it's this model that is dominant today. And so, rather than fight against that model, maybe, to restrain it, I think somehow we need to figure out the force that is there, the motivational forces in the commercial, and realize that those are going to be dominant here. So in my introductory comments, I would simply say the question is whether we've passed the Hippocratic stage irretrievably or not, and that would be the question, right?
Good. Thank you, Bernard.
Great.
Frank?
Great. So I'm also I'm trying to bridge a couple of areas here, and I'll start with a reflection on the nature of algorithmic medicine, which, just to give the other side, to play the devil's advocate, the algorithm is often explained to people as a recipe for doing things, as a series of steps, a set procedure for getting something accomplished. And we've probably also heard doctors talking about cookbook medicine and deriding that as an assault on their own professional autonomy. And so we have this really interesting tension where on the one hand you have a lot of folks who are statisticians, epidemiologists, those who handle big data, who are pushing for more standardized programs of treatment, say clinical practice guidelines that would set up standards of care that would be very clear nationally and internationally. And on the other hand, you have the professionals who are pushing back and saying, we need judgment. And I want to give you a perhaps entertaining example of the types of conflicts of values that could come into play when we're thinking in these areas. So I saw a chart recently from the OECD where they talked about countries and ranking countries by years of life and years of healthy life. In terms of years of life, France did the best or near the best, and Norway was in the middle of the pack, maybe down a little bit. But if you looked at years of healthy life, towards the end of life, a lot of chronic illnesses, others can debilitate folks, Norway was at the top. And so the question becomes, if you were the administrator of a national healthcare system, you might say, if you're the head of NICE in England or something like that, we want to maximize years of healthy life because that's what's going to save the system money. And I was just in England actually with the head of the HSCIC a couple months ago where it was very clear that cost-cutting imperatives were really key. On the other hand, it might be part of people's value set that they just want to maximize life. And they don't necessarily want to find the most cost-reductive approach. So one of the things that's so interesting when you talk about the actual implementation of algorithmic medicine, which is actually often hamstrung by Congress and other political actors in the healthcare system, Health Affairs actually recently released a special issue in cooperation with the AHRQ, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And in that special issue, they've actually found that patients are willing to enable and allow more cookbook medicine as long as they know that there is some professional who can state their case for when they are believed to be outside of the norm of, say, the algorithmic determination of what medicine they should get. And I think that's a nice lead into our next panel, or the next panel I think for in this room is on automated decision making, or maybe it's in the other area, because I think having that degree of competent human intervention that can notice the outlier, the unusual case, is really an important check on, say, overall automation. And I know that as part of the GDPR in Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, that's actually part of the regulations is to try to privilege or otherwise favor algorithmic decision-making systems that have some human in the loop. Okay, so I think that's very important for us to sort of, in going forward, although we want to always be able to take advantage of the algorithmic standardization, we also need to be cautious enough to build in governance mechanisms whereby we have that type of play in the joints in our system, and it's not just simply locked down by a standard. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Solon.
So I'll actually turn to employment, which is an area where I think there's a similar debate happening, in part because human-made employment decisions are notoriously biased in ways that the decision makers themselves might not be fully aware. So there's incredibly rich and important social science research which has demonstrated deeply troubling rates of discrimination against certain people in the labor market. And much of this work doesn't seem to be of the traditional sort where someone is consciously discriminating on the basis of race, but these are sort of implicit, unconscious beliefs which sway how they might make assessments. And so in this world, like in medicine, I think, there is hope that data and algorithms can rationalize, but also make fair a lot of these key decisions which really affect people's life courses and life chances. And I think that those hopes and aspirations are justified, and there are going to be many important ways in which labor markets are transformed for the better as they become more data-driven. At the same time, I think there are important concerns here that persist, in part because many of the ways that we use data is by trying to tease out historical patterns. And we use historical patterns in these large data sets to then guide future decision making. And it could be very much the case that these historical patterns themselves are actually biased. Right? That what we're discovering is that there was bias in the previous decisions made by humans, which the machines are essentially inheriting. And in fact, much of, I think, the excitement in this area is not around a standard notion of algorithm as recipe, where someone sits down to write a rule by hand, but rather what is called machine learning. This is the field within computer science which basically automates the process of discovering these useful patterns in large data sets. And in these instances, it's much less obvious how or when or why bias might enter into it. It might not be that someone is actually hand coding in their particular preference for men over women, but instead that there are historical examples which suggest, based on these biased historical instances of hiring, that actually some candidates are better than others, which is not an objective fact of the world, but rather the imprint of historical discrimination in the records we use to train. And so in that world, there are, I think, important challenges that we need to address. So some of them are certainly technical, and hopefully I think Roxana will talk a little bit about that. But many are also legal. And some of the work that I've been involved in is to look at how effectively discrimination law in particular, and employment discrimination law, so Title VII, can deal with some of these problems, and how we can maybe draw lessons from that study to think about how to deal with discrimination in other domains. And what I and my colleagues have found is that it's actually surprisingly ill-prepared to deal with it, in part because, very quickly, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible, there are two doctrines in discrimination law. One is called disparate treatment. This is the idea that someone is consciously considering certain features which are legally prescribed, so things like gender, race, religion, so on. And those cases are pretty straightforward, right? If a computer is considering those facts, it is clearly illegal. So let's just say that we're in a scenario where there is no explicit consideration of these facts, so do we say this is fair, this is certified as non-discriminatory? Well, no, because there are many ways in which, as I was mentioning, these machines can basically learn to inherit the discrimination of prior decision makers in ways that don't actually involve looking explicitly at these features. And so here, the second doctrine, discrimination law, might seem to provide some leverage, and that's called disparate impact. And the idea here is that there might be what they call facially neutral decision procedures, things that don't take into consideration these prescribed features. that nevertheless result in a manifest disparate impact, and a manifest disparity in the rate at which opportunities for employment are offered to, let's say, men or women. And if there is, in fact, a way to demonstrate that there is such a disparity, it can trigger a legal case. There might be then a burden on the employer to demonstrate that they were, in fact, considering well-justified factors to make the decision. But there's a final prong in this test which perhaps offers the best hope, which is, can the plaintiff show that there would have been an alternative way of achieving the same outcome that had a less severe disparity? Meaning, can I try to find the best candidates for the job with a different method that results in a different allocation of those opportunities to people that belong to these groups? And if you can show that such an alternative exists, then there may be the obligation for the employer to adopt that method. And in fact, it may also well be that they bear some legal liability. Now, I go through all of that to simply say that what's difficult here is that oftentimes data and machine learning are the frontier of what's possible, meaning they are the best we can do to make these decisions, at least in terms of what seems at initial stage presently possible. And so in many circumstances, suggesting that we should do a better job is not always practically possible, or it might involve a huge amount of cost and a fair amount of privacy invasion to collect data that would allow you to make better decisions, which is itself objectionable. So in many cases, what we'll find is that it will be extremely difficult to actually arrive at some persuasive case that this could have been done differently, because this really is at the frontier of what seems to be possible. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Roxana?
Yes, so I am a computer scientist, and what I do is I build large-scale systems, particularly focusing on increasing transparency in today's data-driven web and in today's, data-driven applications in general. The kinds of infrastructures that I build are, you can think of them as crawlers for the web that go out there and identify uses of personal information by various web services such as Google, Amazon, and so on, for the specific purpose of targeting and personalization. And I have I'm building both external tools, external oversight tools that can reveal from the outside how personal data is being used for these purposes, as well as internal tools, programmer tools that can reveal to programmers themselves the implications of their use of users' personal information on their user population. So in some sense, I'm kind of building, I think, the kinds of tools, software systems that are needed in order to answer some of these questions or start addressing some of these questions that were asked before. What are good uses versus bad uses? Well, we have to identify uses of personal data, and companies won't always tell us. Sometimes they won't even know exactly how they're using and what, what the impact is. What the implications are of using personal information. Again, that is not clear from the outside or oftentimes from the inside either. So those are the kinds of systems. And just to give you a couple of examples of systems that I've built, one of them, called Sunlight, an external transparency system that detects personalization of advertisements, prices, recommendations, and a lot of other kinds of personalized or targeted content that you see on the web. That's one example, and we've used it, for example, to study ad targeting within Gmail, and we found two examples of what we believe are contradictions to Google's own privacy statements. In another instance, we're building now this crawler that I hinted at before to identify, for example, out there on the web, who personalizes prices based on some particular user aspect, such as location or their prior searches or the websites that they visited before, and so on. Can we crawl the web and identify who uses that to personalize, for example, prices, if we're interested in that, or personalize some other kind of content? Though, that's another system that we're building, and we're having, we're starting to have pretty good results. So, for instance, we fired it at Booking.com, this particular website, and we identified already personalization in prices within it, as well as in another sister website whose name I can't remember right now. So those are, that's one example of a system, an external transparency system that can answer questions of ours, of researchers, or of privacy watchdogs, such as the Federal Trade Commission. How are people using the data, and can we figure out good uses versus bad uses out there on the web? An example of a system that I've built for programmers themselves, so internal transparency if you want, is the system called Fair Test, which allows developers to identify what we call unwarranted associations. These are any kind of association that cannot be explained by any explanation that the programmer specifies between an output or an outcome of an algorithm and a protected class of users. And examples of unwarranted associations would be things like disparate impact effects, for example, or offensive labels, or disproportionate rates of error, of algorithmic error on the user population. So those are two kinds of systems that we've built, and we're making these, as large scale as we can, so that we can answer, as big questions as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Hey, actually, if I might, Solon, could I just ask a question about the employment algorithms? I mean, so is there, surely without outcomes of some sort, merely mimicking hiring practices is surely not a recipe for success, right? Because we hire badly a lot of the time. So
No, that's exactly right. And the hope is that...
let alone biases. I mean, just even without bias, we're not necessarily good at hiring. So
Right. So the hope is that if you look at historical records, you have evidence of who performed well and who performed poorly, and then you try to find the attributes that are distinctly associated with the high-performing employees and those that are associated with the low-performing employees, and that's generally the way you would do it. The other thing I will just add here, though, is that even performance on the job itself, though, might be the result, at least in part, of all sorts of discriminatory activity within the institution.
Yes.
Right? As we know from high tech and other areas. So.
So let me open it up. Who would like to?
Yeah, maybe, just to bridge the healthcare and the employment. So the question is, are we using the algorithm? So where does the use of the algorithms become not just profitable but useful, right? And so in the employment context, I take it it's not just in predicting who's going to be a better employee, but it's also in shaping employees, I take it, right? In other words, trying to get employees, say, to exercise or to spend less time watching videos on their computers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which all of those are related, again, to, I think, this idea of the fact that the algorithms are being used with an idea that we are now malleable subjects, right? And that the point of all this is to shape us and change us in particular ways. In the healthcare context, I take it, it's not, I don't know if the rationale or the reasoning really anymore is to get the correct medication so much as to maybe also get people to do exercise or for the hypertension, right?
Sure.
In that particular case, right? So to target them in particular ways to get them to change their behaviors. Now, that's going to be different than an older model of kind of peer-reviewed exactitude, and so that's. And it's difficult to extract from that the commercial interests, because the commercial interests are really what's pushing innovation in this context, right? So what's pushing all the innovation, I think, is not, I fear, is not the academy. I don't think it's government. I think it is the commercial enterprises that are modeling on Google and Amazon and Netflix, et cetera. And so the question becomes whether we kind of think about, as we enter this period in the future, going with this stream or resisting it. And so that's where I think it becomes important to look at the larger question of understanding what it is that this stream is really about, and what are the underlying differences in rationalities and ways of knowing that they're bringing about.
Resist or regulate? Resist sounds...
Right. Well, definitely resist seems...
Luddite. position,
But,
yes.
Yeah, right. Regulate, yes. I think in this context, and Frank was telling me about a recent law in France, which involves kind of the equivalent of maybe a Hippocratic oath, but it's more it's a fiduciary duty, right? A kind of bill, which involves open access. I take it, or open source also to the algorithms to a certain extent, so that we would know, and maybe some of those regulations would allow us to deal with these issues, particularly in the healthcare context. Okay, so everybody gets to see what the algorithm is that's telling you which medication to propose. So there are these small regulatory mechanisms that I think are important, but to me it seems as if it's a larger question of understanding the new way in which the logics are functioning and to try and adapt ourselves to those somehow, or not, I don't know.
I mean, I think that I want to put in a sympathetic note on resistance, even beyond regulation, because I think that one problem, again, in the drug field, that I think also bleeds over into some of the issues that Solon and Roxana were just discussing, is the validity of the training data when we're doing machine learning. So really, we have to wonder, is the training data that we're using to make the machine learn, does it have integrity? Is it good, reflective of reality? And at least in the pharmaceutical context, we have deep worries about that because of the work of like Ben Goldacre and others who have shown that despite the fact that the Food and Drug Amendments Act of 2007 requires registration of clinical trials and reporting of the results at penalty of $10,000 a day, unfortunately, pharmaceutical firms overall are just not doing it, and FDA is not forcing them to. And so we have what Ioannidis has called a deeply biased evidence base in pharmaceutical research. And I think that is where, if it feels to many that, and this gets even to some of your work, Bernard, on political disobedience and civil disobedience, if it feels to people that the regulatory regime is inadequate to dealing with the scope of the problems, then I could see folks just saying, look, I don't want to have more top-down enforcement of algorithmic determinations, given that there is not adequate care taken to assure the integrity, validity, reproducibility of the training data that it's predicated on.
So for sure, I mean, there are real problems with the evidence base, as well documented. But be that as it may, take an example. Millions of people are prescribed blood thinners in this country. So there's a drug called warfarin's been on the market for 50 years, pennies a pill, well understood. There are now on the market for the last 4 or 5 years these novel oral anticoagulants, NOACs, which basically do the same job and arguably do it a bit better, maybe not. But they're dollars a pill. Now, who do you want making that decision? And what should the logical basis be? When a clinician is looking at a patient and deciding to use one of these new drugs, would you not want some more rational basis for that decision other than a clinician thinking, it's the last rep that visited me was very nice, I'm going to prescribe the new drug.
Yes, yeah.
Which is probably what happens right now. Wouldn't you want something more algorithmic?
No, well, I would, unless it's the, say, insurance companies that could save money that are sponsoring the trials or sponsoring the research as to what the new things are. I mean, I just think that it's really important to sort of bring just a very critical eye to the whole apparatus. But I guess the reason why I'm resisting a bit is because as an attorney who teaches like health law and malpractice law, it's so interesting to see this push and pull between, over time, over decades, efforts of individuals to standardize, and often reformist efforts to standardize forms of medical treatment, and then the profession pushing back, and then people finding that certain so-called rock-solid evidence was actually off. I mean, one example I would give of, say, an early misfire for big data methods would be this Ansel Keys was an epidemiologist who said that essentially sugar, no, it wasn't sugar, it was that fats was the problem. Fats were making people obese. Saturated fats were making people obese. And it turns out that the people that have done more of the research into the underlying mechanisms of how the body metabolizes food had a position that was pioneered by this guy Yudkin, and now that Robert Lustig pushes forward that sugar is really the problem, right? So you had people taking all these fats out of the diet on the basis of ostensibly rock-solid large N data gathered about, say, lifestyle patterns, et cetera, and then you had essentially, the scientific consensus changed. So I just think that, I worry about sort of over-privileging any particular form of knowledge in an area. But I do agree with you that there are so many areas where, yes, we could definitely stand a dose of rationalization in prescribing and other and modes of treatment. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just quickly add that, among the many waves of AI winters,
Yes.
one of the more dispiriting ones was the enormous amount of effort and hope invested in what were called clinical decision support systems. And these were sort of like early expert systems which attempted to sort of elicit the domain knowledge of doctors, rationalize it, and basically scaffold the clinical encounter to ensure that people were actually reasoning in a kind of rigorous manner. And that those things eventually dovetailed with efforts to bring evidence-based medicine into clinical care. And there is 15 years of incredibly important sociological work that basically showed that lots of those efforts failed, not because of the lack of data or the sophistication of some of the techniques, but a profound inattention to the world in which these tools were meant to be inserted, and the kind of social repertoires of people like nurses, right? Of people who are not necessarily conceived of as crucial to the effective practice of evidence-driven medicine. And so I would just suggest that a part of this conversation also has to be an attention to the social world and lived experience of clinicians, and how these tools are not just questions of enough data, but actually successfully understanding the practice that they're supposed to be supporting.
Yeah, and I think also, just to build on Solon's point, to plug a book I really enjoyed recently in this area by John Markoff called Machines of Loving Grace. He describes the simultaneous development of both artificial intelligence methods, which are meant to replace humans, and human-computer interaction studies, where the computer is conceived of as a tool to assist people. And I think that to the extent that these algorithmic tools are conceived of as assisters rather than replacers of professionals, then I have more confidence in them. But I just worry, about or them being sort of imposed from on high.
Maybe sorry.
So yeah, so I suppose we need to be a little. I think it would be helpful to define the terms a little bit, because when you said algorithmic, I think what you meant was evidence-based.
Yes.
In other words, so we're using algorithm as a bit of a substitute for the idea of being evidence-based. In other words, and we're using algorithm as in a metaphoric way as something that hopefully is going to extract human error, human bias, and help us achieve something that would be more evidence-based. And so that's when I think that then we need to kind of keep our terms very clear, because the notion of algorithmic here, I take it, is that that the decisions are being made by non-humans, but on the basis, of course, of evidence. But the way in which the algorithms are written and what they're trying to achieve, there could be many different ends.
Totally,
right, as
totally.
To what they're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And I think we are they're perhaps confusing these two terms a bit. An algorithm could be, if I liked the rep prescribed the expensive drug,
right,
that's
exactly.
an algorithm. So presumably that is not what we have in mind.
Right.
We have in mind something evidence-based.
Right.
Yeah.
So
did you want to, or Roxana, go ahead.
No, so just to continue on that, we talk about algorithmic decisions, but it's really, the data is extremely important there too, just like you were saying earlier, right? The quality of the data itself is very important. So it's not just algorithm, it's data-driven decision-making, however it's done. And typically, of course, you'll have some kind of algorithm in the middle for that. I think some of the questions that are being asked here are extremely important, but I'm not sure that we can actually answer them and my single way in which I can see answering them is if the programmers, the data analysts who actually build these, use the data and build algorithms around them, if they are given the kinds of tools that they need in order to understand the effects of their uses of the data and passing through algorithms and inspect those effects, right? And because if you can inspect, for example, for discriminatory effects that you weren't expecting before, then those discriminatory effects could be a result of something within the data itself, or the result of some kind of aspect of the algorithm itself, and so on. There can be many answers, and I'm not saying that it's easy for them to figure out. But the only way in which I can think of us moving forward is if we can build some kinds of tools that provide programmers themselves with the ability to just see effects and potentially investigate them to some degree.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I would just echo what Roxana is saying, and maybe add too that there does seem to be an important cultural distinction between the worlds in which some of these tools developed in computer science and the kind of more quantitative social sciences, where, because there was a paucity of data, there was an enormous amount of attention paid to research design and the quality of the data and the instrument, and that in many ways that an attention to those types of problems would actually, I think, help programmers who might come from a computer science background actually recognize some of the deficiencies with the training data. And so I think there would be a productive conversation to have between the quantitative social sciences and computer science, especially when things like fairness might be at stake, to the extent, too, that when there is a sufficient understanding of these pitfalls, which I guess is the title of the panel, then maybe we can also begin to have a conversation about negligence, right? So that there might be some professional norm that says you should be attentive to these problems because they're generally well understood at this point, and failing to even consider it, especially when there are tools to support you in exploring the possibility, might amount to some kind of negligence. Whether that's like a legal standard or not is a different question, but I think we could call it negligence.
Okay.
Sure, and then we should probably open it up, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to, a quick squib on this point of liability. What I think is so funny nowadays is, we've had this conversation about algorithmic accountability in the social sciences, law, computer science for about 5 years now. And the constant response we get from industry is to say, you people are unsophisticated because you don't realize that algorithms can't be racist. They're just math. The people behind the algorithms, the people whose behavior they're tracking, they're the racist ones, but our tech is neutral and good tech. But then simultaneously, the same people often in sales pitches anthropomorphize AI and talk about AI taking on the roles of humans and taking on human responsibilities and human jobs. So you can't really have it both ways. You can't sort of have, say, simultaneously, oh, the algorithms can't be racist, and then say, oh, but we've got this new technology that's essentially taking on the role of human beings. I think you have to essentially, the more you sort of substitute in your technology for the roles of humans, the more you have to think about potentially human attributes of blame, liability, et cetera.
So, just one small thing. I mean, in terms of picking up on your idea of regulation, but also on the conversation that we've been having, and I mean, a lot of it is the question of the black box, which is the title of Frank's fabulous book, The Black Box Society, but it's the black box of these algorithms, right? And so I think that a lot of the answers or a lot of the problems and pitfalls could be addressed pretty quickly by opening up that black box. In other words, I mean, in the context of what medications are being assigned, I mean, if we do actually have access to the algorithm and can really see what it is that they're looking for and fishing for, that would change things completely, it seems.
Maybe.
Well,
maybe depending on the complexity of the algorithm.
Right, yeah.
Shall we open it up, or did you want?
I just wanted to comment on something. I completely agree. I think a lot of computer scientists don't really understand this kind of potential for algorithmics to not be fair, because clearly, they don't have feelings and biases themselves. But I think that's changing. So, for example, I've seen a lot of, just in recent media, right? There is a lot of There are a lot of quotes from companies. For example, from Google last summer, there was this effect that was noticed on racist labels that a particular image tagger of Google's was producing, and Google went out and said exactly this. This is a bug. We're going to fix it. So they're starting to call them as bugs, and this is, I think, extremely important for us. And in fact, this is what I call, for example, unwarranted associations. I call them bugs. They need to be looked for and debugged and fixed, just like we look for, traditionally we look for bugs in functionality, in reliability, in security. But these are new kinds of algorithms that, I think computer scientists are now, especially, in industry, are now incorporating into their systems. And they don't fully understand the kinds of bugs that they can lead to. They understand functionality, performance bugs, things like this, but not as much, unfairness bugs or things like this. But I think that's changing. That's my guess.
Great. Question right here.
Yeah, I think the whole conversation got the tone of your first intervention as if algorithm was a pill. Algorithm is never a pill. It's a tool. Sure. Okay? And it can be useful, but clearly, as it talks about putting things into context, and looking at qualitative data and those kind of things. But really, maybe what we need is an interdisciplinary approach. Because even when you conceive an algorithm that takes into account the specificity of the case, but there are other perspectives that need to be taken into consideration. I don't want to linger too much, but I had a discussion about some hardcore statistician complaining about the difficulty to gather data because nowadays, you have all kinds of qualifying to the data. And I told him, look, we live in such time where we have so much exposure to technology. What about we have qualitative statistics, where you can have statistics that allow you to look at things from different perspectives, even though you have to do much more work in terms of statistics. So for me, it's not a matter of resisting or what else did you say?
Regulating?
Or regulating. It's a matter of mitigating, finding, having information for the practitioner to have enough information in terms of algorithm, process information to make informed decision. Because after all, what algorithms deliver is information. And just because they deliver information doesn't mean you have to gobble it. You have to put it into perspective. So, at the end, everybody in all the panel today give me the impression the internet, data, and all these things are gods. They're not gods, they're tools.
Fair enough.
We're on top of them.
Can I say something on that? Yeah, so no, I mean, that's an important point, I think. I mean, another way to frame that, I think, maybe, is to go back or to recognize that we can't get rid of Clifford Geertz, basically, right? And there's going to be interpretation in here, right? And even in an algorithm that seems unbiased or that's not explicitly biased or something, I mean, when you open up the can, there can be worms in there. And I'm thinking of, for instance, algorithms that predict future dangerousness, particularly in the criminal context, right? And that have increased, and that originally included race when they started in the 1920s to kind of predict future dangerousness. One of the categories would be nationality of the father, ethnicity of the father, black, white, German, Lithuanian, etc. We've gotten rid of that now, but instead we use prior criminal history, right? Now, prior criminal history today is not, it's not race neutral, right? Because of the forms of disparities that we've seen over the past decades. And so it is always going to require forms of kind of qualitative interpretation that can be hidden and that require kind of a Geertzian take on variables, basically, right?
Actually, quickly.
Go ahead.
Just
yeah, and then
right
here.
Very quickly, I'll just say that this actually, I think, picks up on some of the earlier points you were making, Bernard, which are when we use data that is being collected for commercial purposes, we might be inheriting the epistemology of the commercial actor. So it's not just that there's a certain rationality at work in the commercial use of data, but the very categories themselves, which are sort of treated as incidental when they're repurposed for some other function, there is a legacy there, right? Certain things are being collected, other things are not. The way things are thresholded might be different. The way that we define this particular variable, there's an enormous amount of interpretation. And that might be done in ways that comport with very rational reasons of the commercial actor, but which might limit or structure the kinds of insights we derive from them, even when we're putting them to some, I'd say, public health purpose, right? And so I think of Ken Pruitt's work often in this regard, because these are not motivated categories. They're not motivated by some social scientific hypothesis or objective. They're often things that are decided by commercial actors, and we should be critical about what categories we're relying on when we just repurpose it for some other function.
So, hi, I work at Facebook, and so this is not my area, which is why I thought this was a particularly interesting panel to sit in on. I suppose just a couple of reactions. First reaction is, the world, I go back to the definition of algorithm. The decisions that a doctor makes are evidence-based. It may just not be the kind of evidence we want it to be based on. And so, like, how nice the rep was, that's what I'm saying. So he's a very nice rep, seems very trustworthy, I'll prescribe the pills. So it seems to me that part of it is you don't get to start from scratch, you have to start from the world you live in. And it seems to me that the world we live in has problems too. And so the question is, how do you address the new world you want or that's being proposed in a manner that protects against the downsides that you're creating? And for that, I think it's a really important inquiry. I think it does depend on the nature of the risk that might be created. So that's sort of one sort of direction. The other point is, I would say that this whole question of not just algorithmic transparency, but the idea that commercial incentives aren't being used now for socially desirable purposes. People, whether part of it may actually, to be more precise, I think there are issues around disclosure. If someone's targeting ads, for example, hypothetically, to people who are self-identified smokers for smoking cessation, there's a commercial interest perhaps there if you sell smoking cessation. I'm not sure that's a bad thing or a good thing so long as it's disclosed. Maybe disclosure is one, and then I think to the point that you were making, I think there's also this question of control. To what extent is it deterministic, or do you have the ability to say, I don't want to be targeted based on those criteria, or I don't want the algorithm to be the decision maker about what I see or not. I want to have some appeal right for some intervention. So I think you didn't talk a whole lot about the framework of the use of algorithms as a means of giving control or protection. And I'm wondering if that's sort of the next step in the conversation, or if that's sort of a different conversation completely.
I have one. Can I make one? I just wanted to, this is something I wanted to talk about earlier in my opening remarks, but I thought I would just go along the healthcare theme. But I would love for everyone to think about this as an example of the limits of transparency and control, which are that apparently there's mooted in China this thing called a social credit scoring system. And the idea of the social credit scoring system was that you would be able to, you would have a score that was like a social credit score that you could show to anybody at any time. And this social credit score would be a way in which, first of all, it's purposed to increase trust in society. So if someone has always had, just like you could have a good score on eBay or Amazon as a seller, you could have a good social credit score. But then people started talking about the possibility that, well, the government may want to use this score, and they may want to, for example, ding your score if you're too active as an activist or something like that. And also, the other aspect of this that I thought was pretty uniquely troubling was that the score itself could depend on your friend's scores. So that if your friend goes and is too much of an activist, then their score may go down, and then your score may go down. And so this also, I think there are like these patents on social credit scoring, or on your credit score depending on your friend's score, or maybe these alternative credit scoring systems that are called alternative infringed data. And that's a situation where even if everybody totally understands how the system works, in fact, the system perhaps becomes all the more oppressive and constraining the more that people understand it. And so I think sometimes our model of transparency, I think, can often in consumerist context be a great aid. I also, though, worry that there are certain forms of social control that actually depend on that form of transparency, and that could lead to some unanticipated problems.
So the previous panel went 5 minutes over, so I'm taking it as a given that we can go 5 minutes over. Do you want to comment on that, and then Ken?
Yeah. Okay, great. One small comment. Just also, here is where I think the commercial logics kind of inflect and infect some of this. In part because, I mean, so Target, for instance, doesn't want consumers to know that they're being targeted, right? And the targeting is going to work if you don't know. So that's where kind of there are these commercial interests that rub up against these ideas of disclosure, et cetera, that are, I think, vital right now, right?
Ken?
Yeah, I won't make it a question. If you close down, I'll just make it an observation. It'll get really complicated when we marry nudge theory with big data and algorithmic decision making. And there's absolutely no reason that you cannot take nudge theory and its dominant concepts like loss aversion and put it into the algorithm. Now, if you want to nudge people to sort of be good, well, good, they should nudge that direction. But if you take that power, and it's not necessarily commercial power to a political system, let us say Turkey today, and you actually created a nudge theory algorithm about loyalty to the country or to the leadership or whatever, you can move a lot of people very fast in a direction that most of us in a democratic society would not be happy with.
Can I respond? Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
I mean, I love the point about nudge theory because I actually was in a little Twitter debate with Richard Thaler over this piece I wrote criticizing the use of some nudge theory to get people into 401ks. And to him, he says, you know, if we can nudge people toward 401ks, that's going to increase their retirement savings, and that's a really good thing. But to me, looking at the ways in which the primary beneficiaries of 401ks, the people controlling them, have fought against the Department of Labor's fiduciary standards rules, I feel like, well, wait a second. If you're nudging people towards that, you're essentially giving the major firms more money to fight fiduciary standards that would hold them to a higher standard in some way. And so I feel like, yes, we have to ask really critical questions about like what's good and what's not too, even in something that is innocuous as like retirement savings. Yeah.
I'll just add that what's even more terrifying to me is that systems that are optimizing for certain outcomes may latently discover the kind of faulty heuristics that nudge theory reveals, and that they will basically take advantage of them without anyone setting out to do that.
One last comment.
Okay, thanks. Hi. Great panel. Thank you so much. I want to talk about what comes before, so how you get the data, and what comes after. So how do you have due process? Just as an example, after the Snowden revelations, there was huge outcry against the metadata program, that all the phone calls, who speaks with whom, was seen as sensitive information and infringement of Americans' privacy. In comparison, for example, Fotina Cristia, a researcher at MIT, just published work on Yemeni citizens after using their phone call data for 3 years. So she had all of their phone calls and for 3 years. And she justified it by saying it's hard to do research in Yemen and this is a way of knowing, right? She makes really problematic claims that people don't do cross-country calls, therefore after a drone attack, so they don't care maybe about drones. And she suggests that they can infer sectarian practices, which would cause an outcry if somebody did that with data of US citizens. So I'm wondering if there's a global reach of big data, so big data becomes a way of knowing not just, you know, things about constituents of one nation, but it becomes a way of, let's say, US researchers knowing something about Yemen, where there's a war. There's an interesting collaboration probably between a private entity, the phone company, and government and university researchers here. That seems very problematic. And aside from the orientalistic assumptions of the study, it kind of says a lot about who has the right to know, who has the right to take data, who has the right to have consent, who has the right to resist, who can then have due process with respect to this data. So I'm wondering if you can take this international aspect and say something about it. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I mean, so there's an enormous amount of activity that's oriented around phone records in the developing world because it's one of very few data sources, right? And so credit scoring is now done using phone records, and research is now done. And so like, what becomes clear to me, I think, is that what little resources of data that exist in these places get looked at for every single possible purpose you can imagine, right? And the result also is then a regime that makes no sense from a kind of American perspective, where many of our rights are around reporting like the reasons for certain kinds of credit determinations. How do you tell someone that they get credit because of the way they made phone calls, right? Like this entire regime makes no sense in that world. And yeah, it's actually really remarkable to me too that there's just, MIT in particular, has a long history of working with the telecommunication providers, largely in Africa, to do an enormous amount of work that's around farming and around development goals, but in ways that do not involve the active participation of any of those people. So there's a huge amount of work doing too, using satellite photos to help make credit determinations for farmers and get loans. And this seems all well and good, but again, like what rights or participation do any of these farmers have in that process?
All right, on that note, we should probably thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you.